I learned something about war too late for it to matter, and too early for it to leave me alone. What I learned was this: you don't always remember the worst thing because it was loud or bloody or dramatic. Sometimes you remember it because it was quiet, because nothing stopped you, because no one forced your hand. Sometimes the thing that stays with you is not what you did under fire, but what you chose when there was just enough time to think. And you thought wrong. I'm writing this now because I don't have much time left, and because I've spent most of my life telling myself a story that no longer holds together. I don't want my name attached to this, not because I was important, quite the opposite, but because names make people argue about motives. I want you to hear this without defending me or condemning me too quickly. I was an American infantryman in Europe, winter of 1944. That narrows it down enough. We were tired, underfed, and convinced, like boys always are, that endurance counted as virtue. At the time, I believed that if you followed orders and kept your head down, the rest would take care of itself. That belief carried me through training, across the ocean, and into a stretch of ground I still see when I close my eyes. There's a decision I made during that winter that I have never been able to place neatly among the others. I've moved houses, changed jobs, buried friends, raised children, and still that moment sits apart, like a stone in a shoe you stop feeling until you walk too far. At the time, I didn't realize what that choice would cost. We were holding a position near a small village, so small it barely deserved a name. A few stone buildings, a church with a bell that never rang, fields frozen hard enough to ring under your boots. The front line wasn't a line so much as an understanding. Everyone knew roughly where everyone else was, and we all pretended that was stable. Daily life was waiting for light, waiting for dark, waiting for the sound that meant trouble. Hunger was constant, but dull, like background noise. Fear came in waves, sharp, then gone, leaving behind a heaviness that made it hard to care about much of anything except warmth. I shared a foxhole rotation with a man named Harris. That wasn't his first name, but it's what everyone called him. He was older than most of us by a few years, married, with a habit of cleaning his boots even when it didn't make sense to. He said it helped him remember there was a world where dirt wasn't permanent. Harris carried a watch that didn't work. The glass was cracked, the hands frozen at some meaningless hour. He said it stopped the day he shipped out, and he never bothered to fix it. Time's not doing us any favors, he told me once. I laughed then. It seemed clever. There's one part of this I avoided remembering for years, and it starts with that watch. Our orders were simple enough. Hold position, observe movement, report anything unusual. No advances. No heroic. Just stay put. That kind of order sounds merciful until you realize how much responsibility it leaves in your lap. One afternoon, late enough that the light had gone flat, we noticed movement near the edge of the village. Not soldiers, civilians. A man and a woman, maybe, moving carefully, as if the ground itself might object. They were close enough to see, but far enough that nothing was clear. Protocol said to report it and wait. Harris noticed them at the same time I did. He raised his binoculars, then lowered them slowly. He didn't say anything right away. Neither did I. The cold had a way of making silence feel reasonable. Only later did I understand what we had really done by saying nothing at all. I remember thinking about my boots, about how the leather had stiffened and cracked, about how my toes burned and then went numb. I remember thinking that civilians moved strangely in war zones because they didn't know the rules, and not knowing the rules could get you killed. I remember telling myself that someone higher up the chain would handle it, that our job wasn't to interfere. Those thoughts came easily, too easily. Harris shifted beside me and checked his watch out of habit, even though it hadn't moved in months. He sighed. a sound more tired than worried, and said, "Probably nothing." That was the moment. Not dramatic, not loud, just a sentence, barely spoken, settling into the cold air between us. I nodded. We did what we were told. We waited. I have replayed that nod more times than I can count. Sometimes it lasts a second. Sometimes it stretches out long enough for me to imagine doing something else. But the truth doesn't change. I didn't know then how that afternoon would end. I didn't know who those people were, or what would happen because of our silence. I only knew that the light was fading, my hands were shaking from the cold, and following orders felt like the safest thing left. I wish I could tell you I sensed something wrong. I didn't, or maybe I did, and I chose not to look too closely. Either way, that choice stayed with me, and the sound that came later, well, that's the part I still hear at night, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Holding someone is different from stopping them. Stopping is quick. Clean? Dot. Holding means time stretches. It gives thoughts room to move around, and they don't always go where you want them to. The woman sat on the frozen ground, arms wrapped around herself. Harris stood nearby, rifle slung but ready. I paced a short line in the road, boots crunching softly, as if the sound might keep my mind occupied. No one spoke much. She answered when spoken to. She didn't cry. That unsettled me more than if she had. I'd learned how to file away tears. Quiet endurance didn't fit anywhere. At the time, I told myself we were doing the right thing. That daylight would make everything clearer. That higher authority meant higher responsibility. I clung to that idea because it meant the decision wasn't really mine anymore. There's a flaw in that kind of thinking, but I couldn't see it then. As dawn came on properly, the cold shifted. Not warmer, just different. Harris bent down and brushed snow from his boots again, even though there was no point. Habit as refuge. That's when we heard it. An engine. Distant at first, then closer. Not ours. The woman stiffened. Just slightly. Her eyes lifted from the ground to the bend in the road. I saw the change before I understood it. Recognition, sharp and immediate. At the time, I didn't realize what that sound would mean. The vehicle came into view slowly, deliberately, as if it expected no resistance. A German patrol truck. Gray, mud splattered. 2 men in front, 1 in back. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Harris looked at me. For a moment, something passed between us that had nothing to do with orders. A shared understanding that this wasn't what either of us had imagined when we radioed in. Protocol said to maintain control until relieved by our own unit. Protocol also said not to provoke unnecessary engagement. We did neither well. The truck stopped. The men exchanged words with the woman. Short, dot, one, arp, dot. She answered, voice steady but low. One of them gestured toward the back of the truck. This is the part that follows me. Harris shifted his weight. His hand brushed his watch again. He looked at me, not asking, not telling, just looking. I remember thinking that if I raised my rifle, everything would change, that there would be no going back to explanations about orders and responsibility. That whatever happened next would belong to me in a way nothing else had. I remember also thinking about survival, about how exposed the road was, about how quickly things could turn bad, about how many stories ended with a single bad decision made for the right reasons. So I stayed still. Harris stayed still. The woman stood when told. She didn't look at us as she climbed into the truck. She didn't plead. She didn't accuse. She adjusted her coat as if preparing for a long ride, and that was somehow worse than anything she could have said. The truck pulled away. The sound of the engine faded, leaving behind a silence that rang in my ears. It wasn't dramatic. No shots. No shouting. Just the ordinary continuation of a war doing what wars do. At the time, I told myself we had avoided something worse. That engaging would have been reckless. That we had no way of knowing what would happen to her. Only later did I understand how much that ignorance depended on my cooperation. Harris didn't speak for a long time after that. When he finally did, it wasn't about the patrol or the woman. He said, very quietly, "I think my watch is wrong." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because I was starting to realize that the sound I couldn't forget wasn't the engine at all. It was the moment just before it, when everything was still. And I chose to do nothing. Night came early in that part of Europe, or maybe it only felt that way because we were always watching the light fail. Dusk was dangerous. Shapes lost their meaning. Sounds traveled farther than they should. Every decision felt provisional, like you might be asked to justify it later without the benefit of context. After Harris said, probably nothing, neither of us spoke for a while. The civilians, if that's what they were, moved out of sight behind one of the stone buildings. The village went still again, the way places do when they're tired of being noticed. At the time, I told myself that was the end of it. But waiting has a way of turning thoughts back on themselves. The longer nothing happens, the louder your mind becomes. You replay what you saw. You adjust it. You soften it. You convince yourself that whatever you didn't do was reasonable, maybe even necessary. I kept thinking about orders, about how the men who didn't follow them were usually the ones who didn't come back. That wasn't cowardice. It was arithmetic. We all knew the numbers by then. Heroics were for posters. Survival was for the rest of us. Still, there was something about the way those figures moved that stayed with me. Careful, close together. Not like scouts, not like men trained to be there. I remember telling myself that if they'd needed help, they would have made it obvious. People in trouble always do. That was another thing I believed then. There's a part of me now that wonders where I learned that idea. As night settled in, Harris pulled his coat tighter and muttered about coffee. He talked about his wife the way men do when they're trying not to think about where they are. Briefly, without details. He said she hated the cold. I said nothing, because I didn't have anyone waiting like that, and because it didn't seem fair to borrow his warmth. Every so often, he checked that broken watch again. Same habit, same useless motion. I asked him once why he kept wearing it. "So, I remember it stopped," he said. "Everything else keeps going." I didn't understand what he meant until much later. Sometime after full dark, we heard movement again. Not close, not urgent, just the faint scrape of something heavy being dragged across frozen ground. Harris stiffened beside me. We both leaned forward, listening. Protocol said to report unusual sounds too. I remember reaching for the radio and stopping. The pause couldn't have been more than a second, but it felt longer. Long enough for doubt to creep in. Long enough to wonder if we were imagining things. Long enough to tell myself that false alarms got men in trouble just as easily as real ones. At the time, I didn't realize what that hesitation would cost. Harris didn't say anything. He didn't look at me either. He was staring out into the dark, jaw set, as if he were measuring something invisible. I wanted him to say something, to confirm or deny what I was hearing, so I wouldn't have to decide alone. But war doesn't work that way. Sometimes the absence of words is the answer. The sound stopped. Silence settled back in, thicker than before. Eventually, Harris exhaled and shifted his weight. "Probably just debris," he said, not convincingly. I nodded again. That second nod felt heavier than the first. The rest of the night passed, without incident. No shots. No alarms. When dawn finally came, pale and thin, it brought with it a kind of relief that felt undeserved. Another night survived, another mark in the invisible ledger we all kept. It was only after first light, when the village began to take shape again, that we noticed something new, something out of place. And that's when I started to understand that waiting, just waiting, can be a choice all its own. After the truck disappeared, the road looked the same as it always had. Trees, ruts in the mud, a thin strip of sky overhead. If you hadn't been there, you would never have known anything had happened at all. That's what made it hard. We reported in eventually, carefully, factually. A civilian detained. Enemy patrol intervened. No engagement. The words fit together neatly, like they were meant to. No one asked follow-up questions. No one seemed surprised. The war absorbed the report and moved on. I tried to do the same. For a while, I managed it. You get busy. You get tired. You learn to keep certain thoughts behind a door you don't open unless you have to. I told myself that the woman might be questioned and released, that she might make it home, that the war was full of people crossing paths briefly, never to be seen again. At the time, that uncertainty felt like mercy. Harris didn't share in it. Something in him had shifted, subtle but permanent. He stopped cleaning his boots as often. He stopped checking his watch altogether. The cracked face stayed hidden under his sleeve, like a wound you don't show because you know it won't heal. One night, while we were posted together again, he said, "You ever notice how we talk about orders like they're people?" I didn't answer right away. The question felt heavier than it sounded. "We say they tell us things," he went on, "like they can take responsibility, but they don't bleed. We do." I remember feeling defensive, not angry, just cornered. I told him we didn't have a choice, that engaging would have gotten us killed, that we'd done what we were supposed to do. He listened, nodded, then said, "That's what worries me." There was a long silence after that, not the comfortable kind. There's one part of this I avoided remembering for years, and it's what happened to Harris not long after. It wasn't dramatic, no final speech, no moment that felt meaningful at the time. We were moving positions under light fire, routine, annoying more than frightening. Harris was a few steps ahead of me when he went down, not from anything you could point to clearly. Maybe a fragment, maybe something ricocheted. I never knew for sure. He didn't die right away. I sat with him for a few minutes while we waited for help that came too late. He didn't say much. Just once, he reached for his watch and pressed it into my hand. "Keep it," he said, "so you remember." I wanted to tell him I already did. That didn't need the reminder, but he was already drifting, and some things don't need arguing over. After that, the story I'd been telling myself began to fail. It failed in small ways at first, in the quiet moments when there was nothing to do but think, in the way my mind returned. Again and again, to that road, that engine, that choice. I started to understand that survival and innocence weren't the same thing, and that knowing the difference didn't come with instruction. By the time the war moved on without us, I was carrying more than my gear. I was carrying a question I didn't know how to answer, and I was starting to suspect that I never would. Morning in winter has a way of making everything look honest. The shadows pull back. The ground shows its scars. You see what the night was hiding, whether you're ready to or not. I remember the cold most of all. It felt sharper at dawn, as if it had been waiting for us to look up. Harris stretched his fingers and stamped his feet, then lifted his binoculars again. Not casually this time, but with purpose. He froze. That kind of stillness is unmistakable. It travels faster than words. I took the glasses from him without asking, and scanned the edge of the village, following his line of sight. Near one of the outbuildings, something lay where nothing had been the day before. At first, my mind refused to name it. It tried to turn it into a bundle of clothing, a fallen pack, anything that didn't require explanation. But shapes don't lie for long in daylight. It was a man. He was face down in the frost, coat pulled tight around him as if he'd tried to protect himself from the cold, rather than whatever else had come. There were tracks in the snow, more than one set, but they were already softening, losing their edges. I lowered the binoculars slowly. Harris hadn't moved. His eyes stayed fixed on the spot, his mouth slightly open, like he was about to say something and couldn't find the words. "There was a woman," he said finally. "Not a question. A statement." I nodded. The sound of my own breath seemed loud. We reported it then. Of course we did. By the book, as cleanly as we could. A patrol was sent. Officers asked questions. The body was turned over. Someone made a note. I don't remember the exact wording, only that it felt small compared to what lay in the snow. They said the man was likely a local caught moving at the wrong time, wrong place, wrong luck. Those explanations were passed around like rations, meant to fill the space where doubt might grow. No one asked us why we hadn't reported the movement earlier. That should have been a relief. Instead, it settled in my chest like something unfinished. The woman was never found. At the time, I told myself that if she'd been alive, she would have come forward, that she knew the land better than we did, that she'd slipped away while we were still deciding what to do. It was an easy story to accept because it didn't require anything from me. Only later did I understand how badly I needed that story to be true. Harris was quieter after that. He cleaned his boots more often, even though the mud froze to them within minutes. Once, I caught him staring at his watch again, thumb rubbing the cracked glass as if it might start moving if he tried hard enough. "There's a right time for things," he said one morning, without looking at me. "Miss it, and it's gone." I didn't answer. I was afraid of what agreeing might mean. The days passed. The front shifted. Orders changed. That village became just another name on a list we no longer consulted. If you'd asked me then, I would have said the incident was behind us, resolved, accounted for. But there was one detail from that morning that never settled, something about the tracks in the snow. I noticed them again and again in my memory, long after the ground itself had thawed and forgotten. They weren't panicked. They weren't running. They were careful, and I couldn't stop wondering why a man who moved so carefully never made it home. The war ended for me without ceremony. No final charge. No moment that felt like a closing door. One day we were told to stand down, and another day I was on a ship heading back across the ocean, trying to remember what kind of man I'd been before all of it. I carried Harris's watch in my pocket the whole way home. I never wound it. I never tried to fix it. I didn't need it to work. I needed it to stay exactly as it was. When people asked what the war had been like, I gave them the answers they expected. Cold, confusing, hard. I talked about missing home, about friends I'd lost. All of that was true, and none of it touched the thing that followed me. At the time, I believed that once I was home, distance would do its work, that oceans and years had a way of smoothing rough edges. I married. I worked. I built a life that looked solid from the outside. I learned how to stay busy, how to be useful, how to avoid certain silences. But there were nights, quiet ones, when the story stopped working again. I would hear an engine outside and feel my body tense before my mind caught up. I would notice how careful someone moved in the dark and feel a tightening in my chest I couldn't explain. Once, years later, I saw a woman waiting at a bus stop in winter, coat too thin for the cold, and I had to turn away because my hands were shaking. I never spoke to my wife about it. Not because she wouldn't have listened, but because I didn't know how to explain a failure that looked, on paper, like obedience. How do you confess to something you didn't technically do? That question stayed with me longer than any memory of combat. I tried to answer it by being careful, by being kind when I could, by stepping in when something felt wrong, even when it wasn't convenient. People called it decency. I knew better. It was repayment, spread thin over a lifetime. Every few years, I would take Harris's watch out and hold it. The cracked glass caught the light differently as time went on, but the hands never moved. It reminded me that some moments don't pass. They just wait. There's a temptation late in life to soften the past, to say that everyone did what they had to do, that the war demanded things ordinary life never would. That may be true, but it's not the whole truth. The truth is quieter. The truth is that there was a moment when I could have acted and I didn't. And everything that came after, home, family, years, grew around that absence. I've lived with it. I've carried it. But carrying something isn't the same as setting it down. And that's why I'm writing this now, because there is one last thing I haven't told you yet. A few days after the body was found, we were moved. That's how it often went. Just when a place began to feel familiar enough to haunt you, the war carried you somewhere else. New ground, new angles to watch, old thoughts packed away and labeled later. I told myself the village was finished with me. The new position was along a narrow road bordered by trees, stripped bare by winter. The kind of place where sound traveled oddly. Too far one moment, not far enough the next. We were told to expect increased civilian movement. Refugees, stragglers, people caught between lines that had shifted without asking permission. The order came down in plain language, clear enough that no one had to interpret it. Stop unauthorized movement after dark. Question during daylight. If there's uncertainty, detain. If there's resistance. Well, we all knew how that sentence ended, even when it wasn't spoken. At the time, it made sense. We'd already been warned about enemy couriers, about locals paid to watch us, about messages carried in bread loaves or sewn into coats. We were told that hesitation got men killed, that firmness saved lives in the long run. I believe that because believing it made things simpler. Harris believed it too, or at least he didn't argue. He just listened, nodded when appropriate, and checked his watch afterward like he always did. There it is, he said quietly. Now we know. Know what? I wanted to ask, but I didn't. I was learning that questions could be heavier than answers. That first night on the road, we stopped two men with carts heading east. They were old enough that neither of us felt particularly brave for it. They showed papers. We let them through. No trouble, no drama. I remember feeling relieved, as if the road itself had passed some kind of test. Later, closer to dawn, we heard footsteps again. Just one person this time. Slow, measured. The sound came from the same direction as the village we'd left behind. There's one part of this I avoided remembering for years, and it's the way my body reacted before my mind caught up. The tightening in my chest, the certainty, unearned, absolute, that this moment mattered more than the others. We stepped out, rifles low but ready. The figure stopped immediately, hands visible, posture careful in a way that felt familiar. A woman. She was younger than I expected, wrapped in layers that didn't quite fit her, like they'd been borrowed in a hurry. Her face showed more fatigue than fear, as if she'd already spent whatever fear she had on something earlier. She spoke quietly. Not English. Enough German that we could piece it together. She was trying to reach family. She'd been waiting for daylight. She'd misjudged the distance. All reasonable things. all things we'd been warned about. Harris looked at me. I looked at him. The order sat between us, solid and reassuring. No movement after dark. Detain and report. At the time, I told myself this was different from the village. This time, we were doing something. This time, we weren't pretending not to see. Only later did I understand how thin that distinction really was. We told her to sit. She did. We told her not to move. She nodded. Everything was calm, controlled, almost gentle. I radioed it in. While we waited, Harris stood a few feet away from her, eyes down, boots planted. She watched him with an expression I still can't name. Something like recognition, maybe, or resignation. She glanced once at his wrist, at the watch. That's when I felt it. The first real crack in the story I'd been telling myself. A sense that this moment wasn't just another procedure, another box check. That something had looped back around and found us again. The response came over the radio. Brief, thaw, impersonal. Hold her until relieved. We did. And as the sky began to lighten at the edges, I realized I was more afraid of what would happen next than I had been of anything the night might have brought. Here is the part I have circled for decades. The part I kept just out of reach even from myself. The woman on the road was the woman from the village. I didn't know it that morning. Or maybe I did, in the way you know things when you refuse to name them. The coat she wore was different, but the careful way she moved was the same. The distance she kept from open ground, the way she watched hands and faces instead of weapons. When the German patrol arrived, recognition passed over her face. Not fear, not surprise, but confirmation. Later, much later, I learned what that confirmation meant. After the war, in the years when Europe was still trying to count what it had lost, I worked briefly with a relief organization. It wasn't penance. I didn't think in those terms then. It was just something useful to do. One afternoon, going through translated reports, I came across a short account from that region. A local man killed near the village. His sister detained days later while attempting to reach family. She did not return. No details, no drama, just an absence recorded on a page. That's when the story I had relied on finally collapsed. I understood then what we had done by waiting, by nodding, by staying still while time, broken or not, kept moving. We hadn't handed her over directly. We hadn't pulled a trigger. We hadn't violated any order written on paper. But we had narrowed her world until there was only one road left. Is obedience the same as innocence? I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. I've asked it in church pews, in hospital waiting rooms, in the quiet moments before sleep, when there's no one left to impress. I don't ask it anymore because I expect an answer. I ask it because asking is the only honest thing I have left. Harris understood something I didn't, or didn't want to. When he pressed that watch into my hand, he wasn't asking me to remember the war. He was asking me to remember the moment when time stopped offering excuses. I carried that watch through the rest of my life. It's here with me now, beside this keyboard, heavier than it has any right to be. The hands are still frozen, the glass still cracked. I never fixed it, because some things aren't meant to be repaired, only acknowledged. This is not a request for forgiveness. I don't think that's something strangers can give, and I'm not sure it's something I deserve. This is simply the truth, finally spoken without the protection of distance or duty. If you're reading this and wondering what you would have done, I can't tell you. I couldn't tell myself either until the moment had already passed. All I can say is that the quiet choices are the ones that last the longest. The war ended. I came home. I lived a full life, by most measures, but some part of me stayed on that road, listening to an engine approach, feeling the weight of a decision that looked small at the time and proved otherwise. Time, it turns out, doesn't heal everything. Some things it only reveals. And that is what I wanted you to know before there was no one left to tell it.